The mop water had gone cold 2 hours ago, but Garrett kept pushing it across the floor anyway. It was the rhythm that mattered. The slow figure-8 pattern he'd perfected over 11 months aboard the Varath Dominion carrier Ichthalan, a ship so massive that its maintenance crew numbered in the hundreds, and so deeply alien that even the air tasted like copper and ozone. The bristles of his mop were synthetic, printed from the ship's fabrication bay, after the original ones dissolved in the alkaline cleaning solution the Varath used on their floors. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. Learned a lot of lessons the hard way up here. Garrett Lowe was 53 years old, had a bad left knee from a fall off a scissor lift in a Phoenix warehouse 6 years back, a worse marriage that had ended around the same time, and exactly one marketable skill that translated across species. He knew how to clean, not the glamorous kind, not the hazmat, classified clearance, decontamination protocol kind that the recruitment offices advertised in their glossy pamphlets about interstellar career opportunities. The real kind. The kind where you get on your hands and knees and scrub biological residue from deck plating until your knuckles crack and bleed, and then you do the next corridor, and the one after that, and the one after that, until your shift ends and you collapse into a bunk that smells like industrial solvent and sleep, so deep it feels like practice for dying. The Varath had hired humans for 3 reasons. They were cheap, interstellar minimum wage, paid in a currency that converted to just enough to cover child support and a storage unit back in Tucson. They were small enough to fit into maintenance crawlspaces designed for juvenile Varath drones, the narrow access tunnels that ran between decks like arteries in a body too tight for adult Varath, but perfectly sized for a human on hands and knees. And they didn't complain in any language the Varath cared to translate. That last part was the important one. The Varath had a rigid caste hierarchy, warriors at the top, technicians in the middle, laborers at the bottom, and they'd mapped humans neatly into a slot below the bottom. Not quite crew, not quite cargo, something in between that served a function and required no acknowledgement. Garrett had taken the contract because the alternative was a studio apartment in Tucson with a window unit that leaked and a disability check that didn't cover his meds. His daughter was 14 and lived with her mother in Portland and called him once a month on a schedule that felt like obligation dressed up as affection. His brother had died 2 years before, pancreatic, fast and ugly, and the house they'd grown up in had been sold to cover medical bills. There was nothing holding him to Earth except gravity, and even that had gotten tired of the job. 11 months later, he knew every corridor on decks 14 through 22 by the sound his mop bucket made rolling across them. The ceramic-coated floors on 14 rang high and thin. The rubberized surfaces on 18 absorbed the sound into a muffled whisper. The metal grating on 22, down near the reactor access, vibrated with a subsonic bass note that he felt in his teeth more than heard. He knew which junction panels ran hot, the power distribution node at the intersection of 15, and the main arterial corridor was always warm to the touch, a sign of imperfect thermal regulation that the Varath technicians had noted in their logs and never bothered to fix. He knew which atmospheric recyclers wheezed before they failed, and he'd reported the fault so many times that he'd stopped expecting a response. He knew that the lighting strips on deck 17 flickered every 42 minutes because of a short in the relay behind panel 17 J42. And he knew that Commander Othval took his meals exactly 9 minutes after the 3rd watch rotation, because Garrett had to clean the officer's mess before and after, and the commander's schedule was as predictable as the flicker. He knew this ship the way a man knows his own house in the dark, by feel, by smell, by the particular hum of each bulkhead vibrating at its own frequency, a chord that changed slightly as you moved through the vessel, so that Garrett could tell what deck he was on with his eyes closed just by the way the metal sang. Which is why he noticed, at 3:47 by the ship's arbitrary clock, that the hum had changed. He stopped mopping, stood still in the corridor of deck 19, one hand on the bucket handle, head tilted like a dog hearing something just outside the range of human conversation. The lighting was the same dim amber the Verath preferred during their rest cycle, a warm, low-spectrum glow designed for their tetrachromatic vision, which left human eyes straining at the edges of objects. The air recyclers pushed the same metallic breeze across his face. The floor was wet where he just mopped, reflecting the amber light in a long, rippled streak. But something underneath all of it, the bass note that lived in the bones of the ship, the fundamental frequency of 2.3 kilometers of metal and ceramic and alien engineering, had shifted, dropped in pitch. Like a singer taking a breath before the next verse. Like the moment between heartbeats when the muscle rests and gathers itself. Garrett set the mop against the wall and walked to the nearest intercom panel. He pressed the contact pad the way he'd been taught, 2 fingers held flat, firm pressure, hold for 1 second, and waited for the translation relay to kick in. Nothing. He pressed again, held it. The panel's surface was warm. It was always warm. Everything on this ship ran warm, but the acknowledgement tone that should have followed didn't come. No click. No hiss of an open channel. No flat, synthesized voice asking him to state his maintenance request in simple terms. He tried the next panel, same result. Tried a third, 2 junctions down, past the water reclamation access and the secondary waste processing intake where the air always smelled like burnt iron because the filtration gaskets were overdue for replacement. Nothing there either. 3 panels all dead. Not broken, the surfaces were still warm, still lit with the faint standby glow, but unresponsive, as if the system on the other end had been disconnected, as if there was nobody left to answer. Garrett stood in the corridor and did what he always did when something felt wrong. He reached into his coverall pocket, pulled out his thermos, dented, stainless steel, bought at a Walmart in Tucson 8 years ago. The lid cross-threaded from being dropped too many times on too many hard floors, and took a long sip of coffee. It was cold like the mop water. He drank it anyway. Bad coffee was still coffee, and coffee was the last reliable thing in the universe. Then he started walking. It took him 14 minutes to reach the nearest crew quarters on Deck 18. He knew the route the way he knew the mop pattern, muscle memory, worn into him by repetition, the kind of knowledge that lives in the legs and shoulders and doesn't bother consulting the brain. Down the main arterial corridor, the wide central passage that ran the length of the ship like a spine, left at the junction where the overhead conduit had a weld scar shaped like a question mark, through the service door that never sealed properly and let a whisper of recycled air bleed into the passage. He'd reported the seal. Twice. Nobody had fixed it. Nobody ever fixed the things he reported, because his reports entered the maintenance system at the lowest priority tier, filed under the category that roughly translated as non-essential personnel observation. The crew quarters were empty. Not empty like off-shift. Not empty like everyone had gone to the mess hall or the training decks or the observation blister on Deck 6 where junior officers went to stare at the stars during their downtime. Empty like abandoned. Empty like left. The sleep alcoves, deep, coffin-shaped recesses carved into the walls where the Verath folded their elongated bodies during rest, tucking their 6-jointed limbs against their thoraxes in a configuration that looked uncomfortable to human eyes but was apparently the pinnacle of Verath relaxation, were all retracted to their upright positions. Standard procedure for departure. You stowed your bunk when you left, the same way humans made a bed. The personal effects that usually cluttered the shallow shelves beside each alcove were gone. The ambient markers the Verath used to identify their individual spaces. Scent diffusers, mostly, emitting chemical signatures that Garrett had never been able to distinguish from one another, but that apparently carried as much personal information to a Verath as a name and photograph did to a human, were dark and cold. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room. It was 30 meters long and 12 wide, designed to house 60 Vareth crew members. He had cleaned it every other cycle for 11 months. He knew the stain patterns on the ceiling, greenish smears from some biological process he'd never asked about and didn't want to know. He knew which alcove's drainage grate was clogged, and which one had a loose wall panel that rattled during high-thrust maneuvers. He knew that the third diffuser from the left wall had a crack in its housing that leaked a faint sweetness into the air, something like overripe plums crossed with warm copper, and that whoever slept in that alcove had never reported it because the scent was apparently pleasant by Vareth standards. The sweetness was gone now. The room smelled like nothing at all, like absence. Garrett took another sip of cold coffee, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, started walking again. He checked deck 17, empty, deck 16, empty. The officers' mess where Commander Othval took his meals 9 minutes after third watch, empty. The long tables still extended, the surface of each one showing the faint etched rings where Vareth feeding vessels had been placed and removed 10,000 times, ghost circles worn into the material by routine. The medical bay on deck 16, where a Vareth physician had once treated a chemical burn on Garrett's forearm without speaking to him or making eye contact, just applied the salve and gestured toward the door, empty, the treatment surfaces bare, the supply cabinets sealed. The command auxiliary station on deck 15, where junior officers monitored subsystem readouts and pretended not to notice the human janitor emptying their waste receptacles. Empty, the chairs pushed back, the display surfaces dark, a single drinking vessel left on a console as if its owner had meant to come back for it. Every room, every corridor, every station he could access with his maintenance clearance, which was most of them because you can't clean a room you can't enter, and the Vareth had never worried about what a janitor might see. What was he going to do with operational intelligence? Mop it. He was alone on the ship. The realization didn't hit him all at once. It settled slowly, like sediment in still water. He kept walking, kept checking, kept finding the same emptiness repeated across deck after deck, until the pattern became undeniable, and he stopped in a corridor on deck 15 and leaned against the wall and let his head rest against the cool metal and closed his eyes and breathed. The Ichthalan was a Vareth Dominion carrier, 2.3 kilometers long, 400 meters at its widest beam. Crew complement of 4,000, plus 600 auxiliary drones, plus the small contingent of 47 human contract workers who handled the jobs the Vareth considered beneath their physiology. It carried enough weapons to sterilize a small moon. Its engines could fold space across 12 light-years in a single transit. Its hull was layered with reactive armor, designed to shrug off kinetic impacts that would split an asteroid. And right now, every square meter of it belonged to Garrett Lowe, janitor, employee number H031, the man who mopped. He opened his eyes. The corridor light flickered, the one on the 42-minute cycle, right on schedule, 17J42 doing its thing, and for a moment the walls strobed amber and black, and he thought about what his ex-wife Corinne would say if she could see him now. Probably something about how he'd finally found a place messy enough to match his personality. She'd always had a talent for the joke that was funny enough to laugh at and sharp enough to draw blood. The thought made him smile, a small, tired smile that nobody was there to see. He pushed off the wall and went to find out why they'd left. The answer was in the launch bay on deck 8. Garrett had never been to deck 8. It was outside his assigned area, technically above his clearance, and required passing through 2 security partitions that should have rejected his maintenance chip. Both partitions stood open, their magnetic seals disengaged, the heavy blast doors retracted into the walls like jaws held apart. The evacuation had overridden normal security. Every barrier between crew and exit had been disabled. The air beyond them was different, thinner, colder, carrying a chemical sharpness that stung the inside of his nostrils. The scent of propellant residue, hot metal, departure. The launch bay was a cathedral of empty space. The Ichthalan carried 48 combat shuttles and 12 troop insertion pods, each one secured in its own docking cradle along the walls of a chamber so vast that the far end disappeared into shadow. Garrett had heard the launch bay described by one of the other human workers, a young electrician named Peak who'd done some authorized wiring work on the shuttle guidance systems, as looking like the inside of a wasp's nest scaled up by a factor of 1,000. Peak had been right. The cradles were hexagonal, organic-looking, each one a cell in a honeycomb pattern that climbed the curved walls from floor to ceiling. The ceiling itself was 50 meters overhead, lost in amber-tinged darkness. Every cradle was empty, every shuttle was gone. The docking clamps hung open like skeletal fingers releasing a grip, and the magnetic retention fields that kept each craft locked in place during transit were powered down to nothing. The bay floor was scarred with fresh thermal marks, black streaks radiating from each cradle like spokes on a wheel, the residue of 60 shuttle engines firing simultaneously in a space designed for sequential departure. Whatever had happened, it had happened fast enough that the departure sequence overrides had been activated. The kind that bypassed the normal launch protocols and simply blew the clamps and let the shuttles fall free and fire their engines inside the bay, safety be damned. Emergency evacuation, the real kind, the kind that traded orderly procedure for raw speed. Garrett walked to the bay's control alcove, a small booth built into the near wall, its transparent front panel offering a view of the entire chamber. The console inside was still active, its display surfaces glowing with the amber-on-black text the Verath used for all their operational systems. Garrett couldn't read Verath's script. He'd never learned, never been expected to, never been offered the opportunity. In 11 months, no one had thought to teach the janitor how to read. But he'd cleaned enough control rooms to recognize certain patterns. The repeating glyphs on the left side of the display were timestamps. He'd seen them update in real time while polishing consoles, and he'd learned to recognize the cadence. The cascading sequence on the right was a log, entries stacking up from bottom to top, the most recent at the peak. The most recent entry had a glyph he did recognize. He'd seen it on emergency bulkhead markers, on the sealed doors of the reactor compartment, on the warning labels affixed to the hull breach repair kits that he restocked in the maintenance lockers every 30 cycles. It was angular, aggressive, 3 sharp strokes converging on a central point like arrows aimed at a target. It meant danger, or threat, or something close enough to both that the distinction didn't matter when you were the only person left to read it. Below it, another glyph he'd seen before, the symbol for approaching, coming closer. He knew this one because it appeared on the automated corridor signs when heavy equipment was in transit. A warning to clear the path. Something is on its way. Danger approaching. Garrett looked at the empty launch bay, looked at the abandoned docking cradles, looked at the glyph on the screen one more time, then drained the last of his cold coffee, or what he thought was the last. The thermos had a way of hiding a few drops in its dented bottom, and screwed the lid back onto the thermos and put it in his pocket. Something was coming, and 4,000 Verath had decided the correct response was to leave. Every last one of them. In their combat shuttles, no less, not the lifeboats, not the escape pods, but the armed shuttles designed to deliver Verath shock troops to hostile surfaces. They'd left in a hurry, and they'd left armed, and they hadn't bothered to tell the human janitor on Deck 19 that it was time to go. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't even angry, not really. Anger required a sense of betrayal, and betrayal required the expectation of being valued, and Garrett had stopped expecting that from employers a long time ago, human or otherwise. You don't expect the building to say goodbye to the night janitor. You just expect it to still be standing when he comes back for his next shift. But there wasn't going to be a next shift. There was just this, the ship, the silence, and whatever was coming. He rolled his shoulders, cracked his neck, left side then right, the way he always did before starting on a difficult corridor, the ones with heavy staining or equipment in the way, the corridors that required planning and patience instead of routine. Then he went to see what he could do about it. The first thing he did was eat. The officers' mess on Deck 15 still had food in the preparation units. Verath food, dense protein blocks that tasted like chalk and seawater, intended for a digestive system 4 times the length of a human's, and equipped with enzymes that would dissolve a leather boot. But the units also stocked the nutrient packs that had been requisitioned for the human workers. Vacuum-sealed pouches of something that approximated rice and beans if you didn't look at it too closely and heated it long enough. The pouches were labeled in English and Mandarin and Spanish, the 3 most common languages among the human contract workers, and each one featured a small cartoon of a smiling astronaut giving a thumbs up, which had never once made Garrett smile, but which he appreciated in the same way he appreciated any attempt at cheer in a cheerless place. He found a case of them in the cold storage alcove, stacked behind the Verath ration canisters, and cooked 3 pouches on the thermal plate. While they heated, he refilled his thermos from the beverage station that the human workers had jury-rigged in a storage closet on Deck 16, a repurposed Verath fluid dispenser connected to a canister of freeze-dried coffee that Peake had smuggled aboard in his personal kit. The coffee was terrible. It was the best thing Garrett had tasted in 11 months. He sat at the long table where Commander Othval had eaten his meals for 11 months and never once acknowledged the man who cleaned up after him. Sat in the spot where the commander sat because why not? He ate slowly, methodically, the way he did everything. He didn't rush. Rushing was for people who believed the next thing was more important than the current thing. And Garrett had learned a long time ago, learned it from his brother actually, during the long months at the end, when every moment was the last one and you couldn't afford to waste any of them being somewhere else in your head, that the current thing was the only thing you could actually control. While he ate, he thought. The Verath had left because something was coming. The ship was still powered. The reactor was running. The environmental systems were cycling. The gravity plating was holding steady at the .94 standard that the Verath preferred, and that made Garrett's bad knee ache slightly less than Earth normal. The navigation systems were presumably still active, though he couldn't read them to confirm. The ship was, functionally, a fully operational warship crewed by exactly 1 middle-aged man with a mop and a bad knee and a thermos of terrible coffee. The question was what to do about it. He could do nothing. Wait in the mess hall, eat the nutrient packs, and let whatever was coming arrive and do whatever it was going to do. This was the easiest option, and there was a version of Garrett, the version that had spent 3 years on a couch after the divorce, watching reruns and letting the days pile up like laundry, the version that had stopped answering his daughter's calls because hearing her voice reminded him of everything he'd lost, that found it appealing. Just sit. Just wait. Let someone else decide what happens next, the way someone else had always decided. But that version of Garrett had gotten up off the couch, had walked into a recruitment office, had signed a contract for a job that paid badly and smelled worse, on a ship full of beings who looked at him the way people looked at a vacuum cleaner, a useful tool, invisible until it stopped working, disposable when it did. That version of Garrett was dead or close enough. The version sitting in the officer's mess, eating reheated beans with an alien warship humming around him like a sleeping giant, was something else. Something that had been shaped by 11 months of hard floors and harder indifference into a form that was, if nothing else, durable. He finished eating. Washed his tray in the cleaning station, force of habit, the kind that doesn't care about context or circumstance, the kind that functions like breathing, and went to work. The first thing he needed was information. He couldn't read the ship's systems, but he didn't need to read them. He needed to understand them, and understanding didn't require literacy. It required observation, pattern recognition. The ability to watch a process repeat 100 times and know, on the 101st, what came next. Garrett had spent 11 months observing. He started in the maintenance control room on Deck 16, a space he knew intimately because he'd cleaned it twice a week, and had spent considerable time staring at its walls while waiting for his cleaning solution to dry. The walls were interesting. They were covered in displays, not screens exactly, but flat panels embedded in the bulkhead that projected amber-on-black graphics showing the status of every system on the ship. It was the nervous system of the Ichthylan made visible, every heartbeat and breath represented by a glyph or a graph or a color-coded indicator. The room contained the ship's infrastructure management system, the network that monitored and controlled everything from atmospheric composition to water recycling to waste processing to power distribution to thermal regulation. It was, in a sense, the janitor's room, the room that kept the building running, the room that nobody thought about until something went wrong. Garrett had thought about it every day for 11 months. The displays were active, cycling through automated status reports in Varath script that he couldn't read. But the graphic overlays, the visual representations of system status that supplemented the text, he understood those. He'd been looking at them for 11 months, watching the Varath technicians respond to color changes and pattern shifts, noting which indicators prompted urgent action and which were ignored, which combinations of colors led to maintenance calls and which were routine background noise. He'd learned the language of the system without learning the language itself. Green meant nominal, blue meant standby, amber meant attention required, red meant failure. And the spatial layout of the indicators mapped directly to the physical layout of the ship. Top of the display was the bow, bottom was the stern, left was port, right was starboard. Everything was green. The ship was healthy, running on autopilot, its systems ticking along without any crew to monitor them because the systems didn't need monitoring. The Ichthylan was built to fight wars, and war machines were built with redundancy. Take away the crew and the ship didn't die. It just waited like a dog whose owner had gone to the store. Patient, ready, slightly confused about why nobody was giving orders. Garrett studied the power distribution overlay. The graphic showed the ship as a longitudinal cross-section, a two-dimensional slice of the whole vessel with color-coded nodes representing major power consumers. Most of them were green: life support, gravity, basic lighting, the reactor itself. But several nodes were blue, indicating standby mode. He recognized their positions on the ship's layout from months of cleaning the corresponding spaces. Weapons systems. The main battery arrays on decks 3 and 4, massive chambers he'd never entered but whose doors he'd mopped past daily. The point defense clusters along the hull, accessible only from exterior maintenance access that human workers weren't authorized to use. The shield generators that formed the ship's primary defensive barrier, housed in armored compartments deep inside the hull structure. All on standby, all requiring nothing more than activation to come fully online. He looked at the maintenance console he'd watched the Varath technicians use, looked at the controls. They were large, designed for Varath hands, which had 6 fingers and 2 opposable digits arranged in a radial pattern that let them grip objects from multiple angles simultaneously. But the interface was physical. Mechanical switches, pressure-sensitive pads, rotary selectors. Not touchscreens requiring biometric authentication, not encrypted keypads requiring command codes, not voice-activated systems that would reject a human throat's attempt at Varath phonemes. Mechanical switches, hard, physical, tactile interfaces designed for workers who wore gloves and dealt with emergencies and didn't have time to authenticate. Because infrastructure management was maintenance work, and maintenance work was for the lower castes, and the lower castes didn't warrant sophisticated security. Nobody secures the janitor's closet. Garrett reached out and touched one of the switches. It was large enough that his whole palm covered it, designed for a Varath finger the size of a human thumb. He'd watched the technicians use these switches hundreds of times. This particular one, third row, second from the left, corresponded to the secondary power bus that fed the portside systems. He'd seen a technician toggle it during a routine diagnostic, watched the corresponding node on the display shift from green to blue and back. He pressed it, gently, firmly, the way you pressed a switch when you respected what it controlled. It depressed with a solid, satisfying click that he felt through the bones of his hand. On the display, one of the blue nodes shifted to green. He looked at his hand on the switch, looked at the display, looked back at his hand, rough knuckles, calloused fingertips, the cracked skin around his nails where the cleaning solution ate at him despite the gloves, the hand of a janitor resting on the control interface of a warship, bringing weapons online with the same patient competence he used to activate floor polishers. Then he started pressing buttons. It took him 4 hours to bring the weapons online, not because the process was complicated. Each system had its own activation switch on the maintenance panel, and each switch did exactly what it was designed to do, which was the beauty of mechanical interfaces. They didn't guess, didn't interpret, didn't require context. On was on, off was off. The switch didn't care who pressed it, but Garrett was methodical. He activated each system individually, watched the display for any change in the power distribution graphic, noted the effect on the reactor output indicator, a circular gauge that he'd learned to read by watching the technicians glance at it nervously during high-demand operations, and waited a full 10 minutes before activating the next one. He wasn't an engineer. He didn't understand the mathematics of power distribution or the physics of plasma-based weapon systems. But he understood the principle that you don't turn on every appliance in the house at the same time if you want to keep the breaker from tripping. And he understood that patience was cheaper than mistakes. Between activations, he made himself more coffee. The ritual of it, boiling the water in the repurposed dispenser, measuring the freeze-dried grounds into his thermos with a spoon he'd fashioned from a bent piece of maintenance bracket, waiting for it to steep, grounded him, kept his hands busy while his mind worked. He hummed while he waited, an old song his mother used to sing while doing dishes, something about a river and a willow tree, the melody worn smooth by decades of repetition until it was less a song and more a vibration, a frequency he carried in his bones the way the ship carried its own hum. By the time he was done, the Ichthylan's weapons were fully online. All of them. Main batteries, point defense, shield generators, even the electronic warfare suite that he identified only by its position on the schematic, and the fact that activating it made the lights flicker throughout the ship in a way that reminded him of the short on Deck 17. The cross-section on the display was a constellation of green nodes, every system active, every weapon armed. A fully operational warship, crewed by a janitor, armed to the teeth, ready for whatever was coming. Then he went and found the sensor array. The sensor station was on Deck 10, in a room he'd cleaned but never paid much attention to because it was small and its occupants, 2 junior technicians who worked the overnight shift, were quiet and tidy, and rarely left anything for him to do. The displays here were different from the maintenance panels, more complex, more layered, showing data he couldn't begin to interpret. Cascading numerical feeds, spectral analysis graphs, multi-dimensional plots that seemed to represent spatial relationships in a format his human brain couldn't quite parse. But one display was simple enough. A circular field with the ship at the center, represented by a small amber icon, and objects around it represented by small markers with Verath glyphs attached. A radar display. The most intuitive piece of technology ever invented, so intuitive that the Verath had independently arrived at the same basic design because some concepts were universal. A circle, a center point, dots that moved. There were 3 markers. They were close enough to the center that even without understanding the scale, Garrett could tell they were nearby. And they were getting closer. The markers crept inward with each refresh cycle, three small lights sliding toward the center of the field like drops of water rolling toward a drain. Three somethings coming this way. And the Verath, 4,000 of them, crew of a warship built to destroy, had looked at those three somethings and decided to run. Garrett pulled out his thermos, took a sip, hot this time, fresh, the best bad coffee in the galaxy, and went to the command bridge. The bridge of the Ixthalan was on deck 2, and it was the one place on the ship he had never set foot. Not because he wasn't curious. He was, in the quiet way that maintenance workers are always curious about the spaces above their station, the rooms where decisions are made by people who have never once wondered who cleans the floor they're standing on, but because the bridge had its own cleaning detail. Senior Verath drones who reported directly to the command staff. A human janitor had no more business on the bridge than a rat had business in the cockpit. The doors were open. Like everything else on the ship, they'd been left unsealed in the evacuation. The bridge was smaller than he'd expected. Somehow, in his imagination, a ship this size should have had a bridge to match. A vast, dramatic space with soaring view screens and ranks of control stations climbing in tiers like an amphitheater. But the Ixthalan's bridge was compact, almost claustrophobic, built for function rather than theater. 7 control stations arranged in a tight semicircle around a central command platform. A single main display, not a window, but a high-resolution screen spanning the forward wall, currently showing the same sensor data he'd seen on Deck 10. The commander's station, elevated above the others on a raised platform, with its integrated seat designed for a Verath body. Too tall, too narrow, angled backward at 15 degrees, shaped like a tilted stretcher for a being with a spine that curved differently than a human's. Garrett walked to the main display. The 3 markers were clearer here, each one tagged with strings of Verath text that he couldn't read, but that included numerical values he could. Distance, probably. Speed, maybe. Something that was counting down. He looked at the commander's station. The controls there were different from the maintenance panels, sleeker, more refined, clearly designed for senior officers rather than technical staff. But the basic principles were the same. Switches, pads, selectors. Physical input devices that accepted physical commands and translated them into system actions. Verath engineering was consistent across castes. They changed the aesthetics but not the interface philosophy, the way a luxury car had the same steering wheel as an economy model. Garrett climbed into the commander's chair. It didn't fit him. His feet hung above the footrest by a good 20 centimeters, and the headrest was a full 30 centimeters above his skull, and the backrest pressed against his spine at an angle that would have been comfortable for a being with 3 more vertebrae than he had. But the armrests brought the control surfaces within reach of his hands. He settled in, adjusted his weight, wedged his thermos into a gap between the seat cushion and the armrest, and looked at the controls the way he looked at a dirty floor, assessing the scope of the job before deciding where to start. The communication panel was to his right. He recognized it because it matched the layout of the intercom panels he'd used throughout the ship, scaled up and expanded with additional functions, but built on the same fundamental architecture. He found the broadband transmission control. It was labeled with the same glyph used on every intercom panel, the one that meant talk, the one he'd pressed 1,000 times to report maintenance issues to a system that never listened, and activated it. A tone filled the bridge. Low, resonant, the Verath equivalent of an open-channel indicator. The sound hummed in the air like a tuning fork struck against stone. Garrett leaned toward the audio pickup and spoke. "This is the Ixthalan. Human crew member Garrett Lowe speaking, employee number H031. I am currently the sole occupant of this vessel. The Verath crew has evacuated. All of them, every last one." He paused, let that sink in, not for their benefit but for his own, because saying it out loud made it real in a way that walking through empty corridors hadn't. "I have activated all weapon systems and shields. I can see you on my sensors. 3 contacts closing on my position. I want you to know that I don't know how to use any of these weapons. I'm a janitor. I clean floors. But I've turned everything on, and if your translators are picking this up, I want you to know that I will start pressing buttons if you come any closer. I don't know which buttons do what, and frankly, that should worry you more than if I did." He released the transmission control. The tone cut off. The bridge was silent except for the hum of the ship and the faint, rhythmic pulse of the sensor display refreshing. He watched the three markers. They had stopped moving. Garrett leaned back in the chair as much as the alien ergonomics allowed and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hands were steady. They were always steady. You couldn't mop a clean line with shaking hands, couldn't thread a gasket in a crawl space with trembling fingers, couldn't do any of the 1,000 small, precise tasks that made up a janitor's day if your body didn't trust your mind to stay calm. But his heart was knocking against his ribs like something trying to get out. The marker stayed still for 11 minutes. Garrett counted. He counted the way he counted drying time on fresh-mopped floors, the way he counted the 42-minute flicker cycle on Deck 17, the way he'd counted the days since his divorce and the days since he'd taken this contract, and the days he had left until it ended, and he could go home to a planet that didn't feel like home anymore. Then the communication panel chimed. The voice that came through the bridge speakers was not Verath. It was something else entirely, deep, layered, as if three voices were speaking in almost unison, each one a fraction of a beat behind the others, creating a resonance that was more felt than heard. The translation system processed it in real time, converting the alien speech into flat, inflectionless English that came from a secondary speaker near the commander's headrest. The gap between the original voice and the translation created an unsettling echo, like hearing someone speak and their ghost repeat it a half-second later. "Human, you claim control of the Verath carrier." "I don't claim anything," Garrett said. "I'm telling you what is. I'm on the ship. The ship is armed. I'm sitting in the big chair. Make of that what you will." A pause. The layered voices conferred. He could hear them murmuring in the background, a sound like stones grinding underwater, syllables that rose and fell in patterns too complex for the translation system to parse. "The Verath fled from us. They are a warrior caste, bred for combat. They do not flee from a single maintenance laborer." "No," Garrett agreed. "They fled from you. You scared them badly enough to make 4,000 warriors climb into their shuttles and run, and then they left the ship, and then I found the switches." He glanced at the weapons display, every node still green. "I've been cleaning this ship for 11 months. I know every corridor, every junction, every panel, every drain. I know which systems overheat and which ones run cool and which ones make a funny noise at 3 in the morning. I know the reactor's rhythm like I know my own heartbeat, and let me tell you, I know exactly how to make that rhythm stop. The Verath never bothered to learn any of that because they had people like me to handle it, people they didn't have to think about. And now I'm the only one left, and all their guns are pointed at you." More murmuring, longer this time. Garrett used the pause to take a sip of coffee. The warmth of it spread through his chest, a small comfort, a human thing, the kind of thing that aliens never seem to understand, the way a hot drink could be an anchor in the middle of chaos. "You cannot operate a Verath warship. You are not Verath. You do not have the training, the neural interface compatibility, or the caste authorization." "I can't fly it," Garrett said. "That's true. Can't navigate, can't jump, can't do any of the fancy things the command crew did from this chair. But I'll tell you what I can do. The weapons aren't fancy. They're switches, on and off. And the maintenance system that controls power distribution to those weapons, that's my system. That's the janitor's system. The one nobody put a password on because nobody thought the janitor mattered. I've watched the Verath technicians use it every day for almost a year. I know what every indicator means. I know what every switch does. And right now, every switch is in the on position." He paused, took another sip of coffee. "Here's what I think happened," he continued. "I think you're something the Verath are afraid of. Something bad enough that 4,000 of them warriors, every last one, looked at you coming and decided that running was better than fighting. I think you came here expecting to find an empty ship. A prize. Something you could board and strip and add to your collection or your fleet or whatever it is you do with captured warships. You've probably done this before. Probably done it a lot. Silence from the speakers. The murmuring had stopped. But the ship isn't empty. It's got me. And I've got 11 months of knowing exactly how this vessel breathes. I know which relay to pull to vent the atmosphere on any deck. I know which junction to overload to blow the power coupling on the main reactor. I know how to turn the water recycling system backward, which I'm told will flood decks 12 through 20 in about 6 minutes. I know how to make this ship into a bomb, and I know how to do it from this chair, because the maintenance system has emergency overrides for exactly that scenario, scuttle protocols. The Verath call them, and emergency overrides are designed to be simple because they're designed for people who work under stress. People who might not have time to think. People like me. He let that sit for a moment. Let the translation system chew on it and deliver it in whatever tones, the Kaler language used for serious statements. I'm not threatening you, I'm just telling you the math. You can take this ship, but you'll have to kill me first, and I can make this ship very, very expensive to take before you manage it. Or you can leave, and I'll sit here in this chair until someone from my side of the galaxy comes to pick me up, or until the food runs out, whichever comes first. Those are the options. I don't have a third one to offer. The silence stretched. Garrett watched the sensor display. The 3 markers held their positions, 3 small points of light in the circular field, motionless. He thought about his daughter, about what she'd think if she could see him now, sitting in a giant alien chair, bluffing 3 warships with nothing but maintenance access and coffee. She'd probably think he was insane. She'd probably be right. Then the layered voice returned. What is a janitor? Garrett blinked. Of all the questions he'd braced for, demands, threats, ultimatums, the sound of weapons fire, that wasn't one of them. A janitor is the person who cleans up after everyone else, he said. Floors, walls, waste systems, whatever needs doing. Unclogging drains, replacing filters, scrubbing stains, restocking supplies. It's the job nobody wants and everybody needs. You don't notice the janitor until the toilets stop working. Then the janitor is the most important person in the building. Another pause. When the voice came back, there was something in it that the translation system couldn't quite capture, a tonal shift, a texture, a frequency that sat between the words rather than inside them. If Garrett had been forced to name it, he might have called it curiosity, or bewilderment, or the particular quality of attention that comes when someone encounters something they genuinely did not expect. Your species assigns a single individual to maintain the functionality of a warship, and that individual is given access to all critical systems, and your warrior caste considers this individual so insignificant that they abandoned him during an emergency evacuation. Well, it wasn't just me, Garrett said. There were 47 of us, human contract workers, janitors, plumbers, electricians. We handled the grunt work. He paused. I don't know what happened to the other 46. They might have gotten to the shuttles, they might not have. But I'm the one who's here, so I'm the one you're talking to. This is a significant tactical error on the part of the Verath. Yeah, Garrett said. He looked at the green nodes on the weapons display, his green nodes now. Yeah, it is. The murmuring returned, longer and more complex than before. Garrett sat in the oversized chair and waited. He was good at waiting. It was most of the job, waiting for floors to dry, waiting for cleaning cycles to complete, waiting for the officer's mess to empty so he could start his work, waiting for the intercom to acknowledge his maintenance reports that never got answered. 11 months of waiting had given him a patience that felt, in this moment, like the most dangerous weapon on the ship. More dangerous than the plasma batteries. More dangerous than the shield generators. The ability to sit still and not blink. When the voice returned, it was slower, more deliberate, as if each word was being chosen with the kind of care you use when handling something fragile, and the speakers behind the voice were, for the first time, uncertain. We are the Kaler Accordants. We have taken 11 Verath carriers in the past cycle. Each time the Verath abandon the vessel when we approach. Each time the ship is empty. We board, we claim, we add the vessel to our fleet. It is efficient. We do not waste lives. Scavengers, Garrett said, not as an insult, as a professional observation, one tradesman to another. Efficient operators, the voice corrected, and there was a shade of something that might have been pride in the corrected translation. We do not engage the Verath fleet directly. We wait, we approach slowly, we project inevitability, we allow their fear to do our work. When they leave, we take what they leave behind. In 20 cycles, we have not fired a single weapon. Garrett nodded slowly. Scavengers who'd figured out that the Verath would rather run than fight against an unknown threat. Smart, patient, the kind of predator that didn't chase, just followed, steady and relentless, until the prey abandoned everything rather than face whatever was behind them. It was a good strategy. A janitor's strategy, almost. You didn't fight the mess. You just showed up consistently, patiently, and eventually the mess gave way. But today, Garrett said, the ship isn't empty. No, today the ship has a janitor. Garrett almost laughed. It came out as a short exhale through his nose, the kind of sound he made when something struck him as genuinely, unexpectedly funny in a situation that had no business being funny. He was sitting in the command chair of a 2-kilometer warship, surrounded by weapons he'd turned on but couldn't aim, facing down 3 alien vessels whose crews had just learned that their entire military strategy could be undone by a middle-aged man with a mop and an empty thermos and a bad knee that ached when it rained, which it never did in space, which meant his knee ached for no reason at all, which felt about right for a life that had made very little sense for a very long time. Let me ask you something, Garrett said. Those 11 ships you took, were there ever humans on them? Contract workers like me? Janitors, electricians, plumbers, the small ones, the ones in the maintenance corridors? Silence. Then, we do not know, we did not look. We do not inventory biological refuse aboard captured vessels. Biological refuse. The words landed in Garrett's chest like a fist wrapped in ice. He sat very still. He thought about Peak, the young electrician who described the launch bay, who'd had a photo of his girlfriend taped inside his toolkit. About Domings, the plumber who'd taught Garrett how to seal Verath pipe fittings, and who sent half his pay home to his mother in Guatemala City. About Yoon, who worked the laundry systems on Deck 20 and always saved him a dry towel, and told terrible jokes that only got funnier the more times you heard them. About the other humans scattered across the Ichthyland's lower decks, doing the work that nobody noticed until it wasn't done. 11 ships. 11 crews that evacuated and left behind whoever wasn't important enough to wait for. And whatever the Kaler had found on those ships, human or otherwise, they hadn't cared enough to notice. Biological refuse. The same category as the waste Garrett cleaned from the deck plating. Not people, not beings. Refuse. He closed his eyes. He sat in the silence, in the hum of the ship, in the chair that didn't fit him, and he felt the weight of those words settle into the place inside his chest where he kept the things that mattered. His daughter's face, his brother's laugh, the sound of his mother's song about the river and the willow tree, the look on Peak's face when he talked about going home. He opened his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was the same, steady, calm, unhurried, but something underneath it had changed. Something had clicked into place, the way a switch clicks, firm and final, on or off, no middle ground. All right, he said, new terms. The Kaler voice was quiet, waiting, patient like they always were, but the patience felt different now, less predatory, more attentive. As if something in Garrett's voice had shifted the dynamic in a way their 20 cycles of psychological warfare hadn't prepared them for. "You're not getting this ship," Garrett said. "Not today, not ever. This ship is under human control now," which I realize sounds insane given that I'm one man in a janitor's coveralls sitting in a chair designed for something twice my size with my feet dangling like a kid at the grown-up's table. But here's the thing about humans that you need to understand, and I mean really understand, not just file away as data. We are stubborn. Unreasonably, irrationally, cosmically stubborn. We'll hold a position long after any sensible species would have calculated the odds and walked away. We'll fight with broken equipment and empty bellies and odds so bad that a statistician would laugh in our faces. We do this because something in our wiring, something older than language, older than tools, older than the part of our brain that knows what fire is, tells us that giving up is worse than losing, that how you go down matters as much as whether you go down. He leaned forward in the chair. "I've been cleaning up after the Verath for 11 months, scrubbing their floors, emptying their waste, maintaining their ship while they pretended I didn't exist. They walked past me like I was furniture. They left me behind like I was part of the ship's inventory, not important enough to evacuate, not worth the 30 seconds it would have taken to ping the intercom and say, 'Hey, janitor, time to go.' And now they're gone and I'm still here because that's what janitors do. We show up. We do the work, and we're still standing when everybody else has gone home." He tapped the weapons display with one calloused finger. Green nodes, all of them. A constellation of destruction controlled by maintenance switches that nobody had bothered to secure. "You said you're patient. You said you wait. Fine. I can wait too. I've got food for 3 months and a reactor that'll run for 10 years and a coffee supply that'll last about 2 weeks, after which I'll be cranky but still here. I can't fly this ship and I can't aim these guns, but I can keep this ship alive and I can make it very, very expensive for anyone who tries to take it from me. And while I'm waiting, I'm going to be learning, because that's the other thing about humans: we learn. We adapt. We figure things out. Give me a week and I'll have the targeting system sorted. Give me a month and I'll be maneuvering. Not well, not gracefully, but well enough. Because I've been watching. 11 months of watching, every day, every shift, every system on the ship cycling through its routines while I mopped around it. And janitors see everything. We see the things you do when you think nobody's looking. We know the shortcuts and the workarounds and the jury-rigged fixes that the manuals don't mention. We know where the bodies are buried, literally and figuratively." He sat back. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave. You're going to go back to wherever you came from, and you're going to tell your people that the age of easy scavenging is over, because humans are on these ships now. In the maintenance corridors and the waste processing bays and the crawl spaces that nobody else fits into. We're the ones replacing the filters and fixing the wiring and unclogging the drains, and while we're doing it, we're paying attention. We see every system. We touch every surface. We know every sound this ship makes in the dark. And the next time a crew abandons their vessel, they're going to leave behind people who know that ship better than they ever did. People who have been invisible their whole lives and have finally realized that invisible means everywhere." The silence that followed was the longest yet. It stretched across the bridge like a held breath, filling the space between the humming bulkheads and the glowing displays. Garrett sat in it, breathing slowly, his hands resting on the armrests of a chair built for a species that had considered him beneath notice. The ship hummed around him, the new, deeper hum that he'd first noticed with a mop in his hand on Deck 19, a lifetime ago and a few hours back. The hum felt different now, not ominous, expectant, like the ship was listening. When the Kaler spoke again, the layered voice had changed. The 3-part harmony had tightened, synchronized, the way voices do when a group stops debating and reaches consensus. "We have encountered 2,417 species in our exploration of this arm of the galaxy." Garrett waited. "None of them have ever responded to our approach by mopping a floor. Despite everything, despite the fear and the loneliness and the weight of 11 months of being invisible, and the knowledge that biological refuse had names, Garrett felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Just a fraction. Just enough. He looked down at his hands. They were rough, calloused, the nails trimmed short because long nails caught on cleaning rags and snapped in crawlspace hatches. The skin around his knuckles was permanently dry from cleaning solution. There was a scar on his left index finger from a slipped gasket wrench on deck 21, and another on his right palm from the scissor lift fall in Phoenix, the one that had wrecked his knee and his marriage in the same month. Janitor's hands. Not warrior's hands. Not commander's hands. Not the hands of anyone who mattered in the eyes of every being who'd ever employed him, human or alien. But here they were, resting on the controls of a warship, and the warship was listening to them. That's because you've never met a species stupid enough to send its janitors to war, Garrett said, and smart enough to make it work. On the sensor display, the 3 markers began to move. Outward, away from the center. Slowly at first, then faster, the distance growing with each refresh cycle until the markers reached the edge of the circular field and, one by one, disappeared. The bridge was quiet, the ship hummed. The lights on the weapons display glowed green, steady and patient, waiting for instructions from hands that smelled like cleaning solution and cheap coffee. Garrett sat in the commander's chair for a long time. He sat there until his coffee went cold again, and the silence stopped feeling like emptiness and started feeling like space, room to breathe, room to think, room to become something other than what he'd been told he was, room to be the last man on a ship that was no longer someone else's, room to be the first thing the Kaler accordants had ever met that they couldn't figure out. Then he got up, climbed down from the chair, feeling his bad knee protest the drop, the way it always did, the way it always would, adjusted his coveralls, straightened his back, rolled his shoulders. He had floors to mop. The ship wasn't going to clean itself. But first, he was going to figure out the navigation console. He'd start the way he started every new area: observation, pattern recognition, careful experimentation. He'd watch the displays cycle through their routines, note the relationships between inputs and outputs, build a mental model of the system the way he'd built a mental model of every system on this ship, not through education, but through presence. Through the simple, stubborn act of being there, every day, paying attention when nobody asked him to. And after the navigation console, the targeting systems. And after that, the communication array, properly this time, not just the broadband shotgun blast he'd used to hail the Kaler, but the focused, long-range system that could reach human space and tell them what had happened. Tell them about the Kaler accordants and their 11 stolen ships and the crews that left their humans behind. Tell them that a janitor from Tucson was sitting on 2.3 kilometers of alien warship and needed someone to come collect him before his coffee ran out. And tell them to check those other ships, to go back and look through what the Kaler had discarded, because biological refuse had names and someone should learn what they were. Someone should say them out loud: Peak, Domings, Yoon. And all the others on all the other ships, the invisible ones, the ones who mopped and wired and plumbed and were never important enough to save. He stopped at the bridge door and looked back, at the commander's chair too tall for him, at the weapons display all green, at the sensor field empty now, clear in every direction. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the thermos, unscrewed the cross-threaded lid, tilted it back and let the last drops of cold coffee. There was always a little left at the bottom, trapped in the dent. The thermos's last stubborn act of generosity hit his tongue. Then he put the thermos away and went to work. On deck 17 the light flickered, right on schedule, 42 minutes to the second. The short in relay 17J42, reliable as sunrise, persistent as a grudge. Garrett made a mental note to fix it. He had the time now. He had tools and access and a ship that answered to his hands. He had the time and the patience and the stubbornness that came from being the kind of person the universe kept overlooking and who kept showing up anyway. The mop was where he'd left it, leaning against the wall on deck 19, faithful as a dog. The bucket beside it, water flat and gray and cold. He looked at them, his first tools, the instruments of his invisibility, the things that had carried him through 11 months of being nobody on a ship full of somebodies, and he left them there. For now. He had new tools to learn, new floors to walk, new rooms to enter, rooms with consoles and controls and systems that no one had ever expected a janitor to touch. But later, after the navigation was sorted and the communications were configured, and the first message was sent spiraling through folded space toward home, he'd come back for the mop. He'd come back because the floors still needed cleaning, and because some things you don't stop doing just because your circumstances change. Because the man who forgets where he came from loses the thing that got him here. A janitor who becomes a captain is still, in the ways that matter, a janitor. And the best janitors never leave a job unfinished.